Well, good evening. You've seen the little ad up there. I'm not going to take any time to even talk about that. Most of you probably already know about the Scripture on Creation podcast and so forth. We're going to jump right into our topic tonight, which is the historical accuracy of the Bible. Now, you know, there is more than one kind of history, and the Bible deals with more than one kind of history, I guess you might say. The Bible records human history, and that tends to be the history that we are more familiar with and think about and study, all the way from the first human to the point of this whole book, and that is the birth of the Messiah. But then there is more history after that, through the book of Acts and so forth. But there's also information in the Bible about natural history. Natural history is talking about nature and the process of nature. So what would we be talking about? What process of nature would we be talking about? Well, creation, where things on the earth, physical things, came from. So we're going to split this up into two parts. One, we'll talk some about human history, and then we'll talk some about natural history. Maybe a little more about natural history, since that's more my field. But, you know, people ask the question, and there are a lot of skeptics and critics out there that say the history that's recorded in the Bible is there's no support for it, doesn't make any sense, it's all wrong. And of course, there's a motivation for that. If we say this is all wrong, then we don't have to listen to the things that touch our moral lives, right? It's just a collection of man's ideas, and those change, and so we'll figure out a way to discredit this book. The thing is, when we're talking about human history, archaeology, which is the study of the buried treasures, you know, pyramids, tells are one of the formations that when they dig it up, they'll find the remains of a city and so forth underneath it. Archaeology has only verified time after time that the people and places mentioned in the Bible are accurate. Now, we haven't found everything in the dirt that the Bible talks about, but whenever we do find something, oh, lo and behold, even though all these different critics said that that never happened or they didn't exist, we find evidence that indeed they did exist. And one of the things I want to be careful about is not to indicate that, okay, so I'm not going to really take this book at its word until it's proven to me. What I'm trying to emphasize is, though people will criticize or object to what it says, we keep finding things that demonstrate that their objections are invalid. A few of the well-known skeptics have said over many years that there was no evidence or any place called Shechem in Canaan. Well, I'm not going to go through all these different details. We don't have time. But this is just a quick little rundown of some of the big ones where they were just so certain that Shechem never existed. Well, guess what? The remains of Shechem have been found. The Exodus through the Red Sea. How many of you have ever seen those videos of the chariot wheels down at the bottom of the Sea of Aqaba? You know, there's a lot of confusion about where Mount Sinai is. Not Mount Sinai in Egypt. I mean, everybody knows that that big mountain is called Mount Sinai, but the Mount Sinai of the Bible is in Arabia. And Paul says that. Why there was ever any confusion about that mountain in Egypt being Mount Sinai, it's beyond me, because Paul flat out says in Galatians that Mount Sinai was in Arabia. And so a lot of research has been done, and artifacts, Jewish artifacts, have been found around that mountain, and the crossing of the Red Sea has some fascinating evidence about why in the world would there be chariot wheels at the bottom of the Sea of Aqaba. Jericho, didn't mean to go forward there. Jericho is another city where they have found the remains of the walls of a huge city collapsed in. They know where Jericho is, as well as the evidence for the walls being collapsed. For a long time, the existence of King David was doubted. Evidence for King David has been found, and we're going to look at one of those things. Hezekiah is another king of Egypt, king of Israel, that we now have evidence, a lot of evidence for his existence and events in his life that were recorded in the Bible. So here's some evidence that was discovered in 1993. It was discovered in the Tell, and they call it the Tel Dan Stele, or Stella. I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm never quite sure. Is it Stella? I think it's Stella. And on this stone, they find writing that mentions the king of Israel and the house of David. The latter understood to be the dynasty of Judah, the house of David. And it's generally accepted now that this is a reference to the dynasty of David, of King David. Now, you just think about this. Up to this point, all the information that we've got, all the details that we have about David in the Bible, swept away. Who cares? That's completely ignored. And yet, you find a rock with some cuneiform and David's name mentioned in there, and then you've got these quote-unquote biblical scholars, accepting that. It's interesting, the different standards when it comes to accepting what the Bible says versus what archaeologists find written in the rocks. This is one of my favorites, Sennacherib's Prism. If you remember who Sennacherib was, he was the king during the days of King Hezekiah, and he had won many, many victories in Judah. He'd taken many towns, but he couldn't take Jerusalem. So he surrounded Jerusalem, and if you know the story, he threatened King Hezekiah, and the king, even the watchman on the wall even said, don't speak in Hebrew. We understand Aramaic, speak in Aramaic, because they didn't want the people in the city to be discouraged by what the general was saying, but they went ahead and spoke in Hebrew and made all these threats. Well, written on Sennacherib's Prism is an account of the victories of Sennacherib, and he brags about how he has Hezekiah pinned in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. And he talks about many of the towns that he had captured, and there's a record of even the names of these towns in the Bible. But what's really, really interesting on this prism, there's no mention of Sennacherib actually capturing Jerusalem. Well, we know why, because he didn't capture Jerusalem, and in fact, in one night, the Lord sent an angel and wiped out 180,000 Assyrian troops, and they went back to Assyria with their tail between their legs. Nabonidus was probably the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar through his mother. So he wasn't a direct descendant by son to Nebuchadnezzar, but he was the king of Babylon, and his son, Belshazzar. Remember what happened to Belshazzar? The handwriting on the wall, and Daniel interpreted it, and that night he said, your life will be required of you. This particular Nabonidus cylinder, they call it, records Nabonidus' eldest son, Belshazzar. So again, these kings are real people. The relationships are recorded in documents other than just the Bible. Then the Nabonidus Chronicle describes the conquest of Babylon by the Persian king Cyrus the Great. And there's a lot of biblical record in the book of Isaiah, Jeremiah, about Cyrus. This is called the Pilate Stone. And there's quite a bit of information, archaeological information about Pilate. And even from the archaeological records, Pilate was the prefect of Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Notice these dates are now getting bigger again. I maybe should have mentioned the BC dates. They started out with bigger numbers, and as history goes, the numbers get smaller. I don't know if you noticed the BC dates there with Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus and so forth. In any event, Pilate was the prefect, or the governor, we might say, from 26 to 36 AD, exactly in the period of time that we understand the life of Christ's ministry took place. There are a number of testimonies to the reality of Pilate. What's amazing is these things have not been in our hands. These archaeological finds have not been around that long. Notice this one was found in 1961. In Italy, there is the Arch of Titus. Titus was the general that led the army that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD. And here is a depiction on this relief of them sacking and then taking away the spoils of Jerusalem. Can you see the menorah there? And also the larger square item there probably is the table of showbread. What's fascinating about that particular event in history, it's not recorded in the Bible other than Jesus said that not one stone would stand upon another one day, but it is recorded in other historical accounts that Titus had told them not to burn the temple because it was full of gold. And yet they took a few items out, but then burned the temple. And so all that gold melted. And so what did they do? They took every stone down to go down and get all the gold that they could from it being melted. It's amazing how the details, even the predictions that the Lord gave on something as specific as no stone would stand on another, we find historical accounts verifying those details. An amazing fulfillment of prophecy concerning the nation of Israel. Of course, all the way back to Abram, the Lord promised the land to Abraham and his descendants. That is the nation of Israel. And yet we've seen how many different times the Israelites get booted out of their land. And yet, where are they today? They're back in the land. But let's look a little bit of this prophecy because it's a very, very important part of the fulfillment of human history. This particular passage in Isaiah chapter 44, written around 700 BC, over 150 years before these events took place. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. I, the Lord, am the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself and spreading out the earth all alone. It is I who says of Jerusalem, she shall be inhabited, and of the cities of Judah, they shall be built, and I will raise up her ruins again. Now imagine when they were reading this after Nebuchadnezzar had ransacked the city. They're thinking, well, how can this promise be fulfilled? The Lord goes on to say, it is I who says of Cyrus. Well, this is 150 years before Cyrus was king of Persia. He is my shepherd, and he will perform all my desire. And he declares of Jerusalem, she will be built, and of the temple your foundation will be laid. Well, 150 years later, approximately, it happened in 536 BC. So we see the Lord having this land, and we see the Lord punishing his people when they were sinning against him, and he carted them out, and then he would bring them back. But what is truly amazing then is that long after the Israelites came back out of Babylon into the land, and Herod built the great temple, and so on and so forth. We understand that once they rejected their Messiah, the Lord's words that not one stone will be left upon another on this temple would be fulfilled. And in 70 AD, it appeared that that promise no longer applied. Israel was done. Well, the Lord's promises cannot be compromised. They can't be stopped by no matter how much human effort there is to stop them. And in 1948, after World War II, the Allied powers of the world established the nation of Israel again in the land of Palestine. Honey, I'll take that water, thanks. And so we have, thanks, I need it hot. We have just a very short smattering there of the kinds of human history that we see in the Bible verified by various archaeological findings. There are so many, and I'm not an archaeologist, so I'm sure I could go back and find probably details about archaeological finds that might even be more interesting than these. But some of the key ones I do think are, to me, the Red Sea crossing and the evidence for where the Israelites crossed the Red Sea. The information is all about the Sea of Reeds, and they went through just sort of a swampy area, but that doesn't fit where Mount Sinai is, or where the Red Sea would be according to what the biblical record is. So then to find evidence of a crossing in an area where they were cloistered and trapped up against the sea, I think is a very, very significant archaeological verification of what the Bible tells us. And then to find records of David, I think that is just, because, David is a sort of rather a key character in the line of the Lord. So that was just a brief look at some human history, but what about natural history? The history of, quote unquote, nature. Well, the Bible presents the history of the origin of the heavens and the earth, the diversity of life on the earth, and the origin of the human race. So the Bible presents these things, but a lot of people, when they read what the Bible says about, on this day he did that, and then on the second day God did the other thing, that can't be. And they ask the question, hasn't science disproved all kinds of things that the Bible claims about where everything came from? Well, a lot of people think that scientists have disproven a lot of it. Probably the most common objection being the time involved, 6 days of creation versus 4 billion years of evolution. So what I want to do is look, I'm not going to discuss these, a few of these details we will look at, a couple tonight, a few as we go through the week. But this is just a list of phenomena that are short-lived. These things all take place quickly. These things all demonstrate a short period of time versus what is claimed to have taken billions of years for many of these things, or millions of years, depending on what particular detail we're looking at. So every one of these things dictate against the idea of a 13 billion year old universe, or a 4 billion year old solar system, or even a 100,000 year old human race. Small diameters of all expanding nova. When a nova explodes, then it expands. It's been found that there's many of them are, the expansion of the nova is very small compared to what it should be if it was that old. The existence of comets and solar wind and space dust. The moon's regression from the earth. You know what we're talking about there? The moon is slowly moving away from the earth. Well, no big deal unless that's been going on for 4 billion years. Come back 4 billion years. And where is the moon? It is so close to the planet that the two could not exist. A small amount of meteoric dust on Earth. The Earth's rotational decay. The Earth's magnetic field decay. Helium in the atmosphere. You know, we all should be talking like this. Because the uranium, when it decays, releases helium. And if the Earth is billions of years old, the atmosphere should have so much more helium in it than it does. The salt levels in the oceans, the thickness of ocean sediments, the speed of volcanic layer deposition. We'll be looking at some of that on Wednesday night. Multiple layers of folded sedimentary rock. That'll be part of that talk on Wednesday. Ice core layering in Greenland. You know, they'll take a layer and they say this represents a year. But the fact of the matter is we find out that when we've got something buried under many, many, many layers, and we know when those planes were stuck there on Greenland and we count the layers, we find out, oh, every layer doesn't represent a year, it represents a storm. How many storms per year, and so on and so forth. Dinosaur and human artifacts buried together. Polystrate fossils, in other words, fossils extending through multiple layers of strata. Soft tissue in dinosaur bones. We're going to look at that tonight. Human mitochondrial DNA mutation rates. We're going to look at that tonight. Degradation of the human genome. Given the rate of mutation, there's no way that the human race can be as old as the evolutionists say we are. There would be just nothing but sterile human beings at the rate we're going. Helium in zircons, similar argument to the helium in the atmosphere. Radio halos, rapid speciation. In other words, it doesn't take a really long time for one species to adapt and become what scientists then identify as two different species. Descriptions of dinosaurs in ancient literature. And we'll touch on that tonight as well. So what about natural history? Well, we're going to look at a few examples. The Bible describes an expanding universe. Now, it doesn't use the word expanding universe. I think it's a bit presumptuous to expect the Bible to use the specific scientific terms that we use, but the description is of a universe going like this, expanding. 17 times the Bible refers to God stretching the heavens. We read that one in Isaiah chapter 44. Let's look at it again. Thus says the Lord your Redeemer, and the one who formed you from the womb. He's speaking to Israel. He says, I, the Lord, am the maker of all things, stretching out the heavens by myself. I think it's interesting that he says by myself. He doesn't say, and billions of years to sort of, help me get the stuff out there. However, though we understand the universe is expanding, that was controversial up to about 1929. Einstein, for example, rejected the idea, and he admitted that the reason that he did not like the idea of an expanding universe was because, if it's expanding, well, then you go back in time. What does that mean? Well, it started from a source. It had to have a beginning, and then out it goes. And for something to have a beginning, you've got to have an originator. And Einstein was an atheist. And he admitted later that he just didn't like the idea of there being a creator, something that started the universe. And so he actually had a strange little fudge factor in his E equals MC squared formula to fit the idea that the universe was static. It was, infinite, but static, as opposed to expanding. Well, 1929, Hubble, the astronomer that our telescope is named after, Hubble Einstein showed the scientific community with the evidence that was at this point pretty irrefutable, that the universe is expanding. And to Einstein's intellectual credit, he accepted it, took out the fudge factor, and produced that beautiful, simple explanation of natural reality, E equals MC squared, which, by the way, is very interesting because it then correlates matter, energy, and time, all three interrelated. You don't have any one without the other two. But Einstein then accepted the idea of this expanding universe. The Bible had been talking about it all the way since Job, 4,000 BC. 4,000 years ago, excuse me, don't want to give you the wrong date. 4,000 years ago, around 2000 BC. The Bible says the world is round and hangs in empty space. What about all this world is flat and the Bible teaches four corners and all that? That's not what the Bible teaches by any means. That's all language of appearance. When's the last time when you got up, you said, oh, I'm so glad the earth rotated so that the sun came into view? What do you say? The sunrise. And this is the kind of language the Bible uses. We're going to look at a couple of verses. We're going to look at a couple of verses in Job chapter 26. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible that speaks of the power of the Creator. I'll just start reading at verse 7. He stretches out the north over empty space and hangs the earth on nothing. He wraps up the waters in his clouds, and the cloud does not burst under them. He obscures the face of the full moon and spreads his cloud over it. He has inscribed a circle on the surface of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. So here we have the expression of a earth being round, even the boundary of light and darkness. This famous photograph that the astronauts in Apollo 13 took of Earth as they looked back. So the Bible doesn't indicate that the world is flat. It has information in here that indicates the world is round and even hangs in empty space. The Bible describes a dinosaur. Is that possible? Yep. Job chapter 40. Most of you are probably familiar with this, I would imagine. Job chapter 40, verse 15. And it's important to be reminded of the context. Starting in chapter 38 of Job, what God is doing is he's presenting object lessons to Job that he created these things. They then say what about him? If God is making something up, then that doesn't say anything about him. So when God speaks about Behemoth, he's talking about a creature that Job is familiar with. And what is the description of Behemoth? Starting at verse 15, behold now, Behemoth, which I made as well as you, he eats grass like an ox. So it's an herbivore. It's not a crocodile or an alligator. Behold now his strength and his loins and his power and the muscles of his belly. He bends his tail like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs are like bars of iron. So here is another key detail. He has a huge tree trunk-like tail. Boy, you all have had enough tree trunks around here, haven't you? Boy, we were stunned when we came through here. We had no idea that we hear about Asheville and everything in the rest of the country. We had no idea the destruction that Helene caused here as well. So it's an herbivore, so it's not a crocodile, and it's got a giant-like tail. So it's not a hippopotamus or an elephant, something like that. So what kind of creature is huge, has a giant tail, and is an herbivore? Well, we don't know exactly. Back in Job's day, they called it Behemoth, some giant sauropod. There's footprints of creatures like this in many parts of the world. Thing is, how could we have a dinosaur being described that Job was familiar with when apparently, according to the theory of evolution, there's no way that dinosaurs lived with man. They weren't around. In fact, they haven't been around for 65 million years approximately. The date changes now and then, but give or take 65 million years. And this idea is entrenched in evolutionary theory right now. Well, the thing is, discoveries of unfossilized tissue in dinosaur bones are causing real problems for this assertion that dinosaurs have been extinct. At a minimum, of 65 million years. Creationists have done research. Back in 1998, a creationist presented research. But one of the most famous publications documenting this idea of soft tissue in dinosaur bones was in 2005. They announced the discovery of collagen, that's a protein, and the collagen was still protein. It wasn't mineralized. It wasn't a fossil, technically. And they claimed that this protein that they found was 68 million years old. Well, that's great preservation. And they talk about this in these articles. They're stunned at how could this stuff be preserved that long? The article is entitled Soft Tissue Vessels and Cellular Preservation in T-Rex by Dr. Mary Schweitzer. I believe she was a professor at North Carolina, University of North Carolina. It was published in Science. This is not a creation publication. Science is one of the premier secular journals. These are pictures in that article of the kind of material she found in these T-Rex bones. So it's important to recognize the scale. That little black line represents a 0.5 millimeter. So a millimeter is about the thickness of a dime. So we're talking about material there that they've taken out of the bone that is a couple of the thickness of a couple of dimes. So, I mean, this isn't like microscopic. You can see it. It's in there. Here's some ligament material here on the bottom. Another thing that she then did was dissolve away the bone, and some of it was mineralized. The outer portion of the femur had mineralized. It was down inside where the fossilization process hadn't taken place yet, over 68 million years. So she dissolved away the hard material, and these are the pictures of the soft material left. You can see the blood vessels. We move ahead again. Here's one where you can see the blood vessels. That's not blood, but in taking away the minerals with fluids, the blood vessels are flexible. They have liquid in them, and they even have, see those little dots? Those are red blood cells still remaining in the blood vessels of the T-Rex. Now, notice that the comparison, so that you get a feel for what T-Rex blood vessels and other organisms' blood vessels look like, the comparison is made between a T-Rex and an ostrich. Now, how many different animals could you pick to compare blood vessels to blood vessels? Why the ostrich? It's still this attempt to just show you that, see, now ostriches, they're almost like a bird. They're almost like a dinosaur. And so, you see, these ostriches that evolved from dinosaurs, their blood vessels look just like the T-Rex blood vessels. As opposed to, but how is it that those 68 million year old blood vessels look just like a 68-day-old ostrich blood vessel? That would be the question that I would ask. Here's some work done by Mark Armitage, a creationist, a skilled electron microscopist, soft tissue in a Triceratops horn. There's a picture of the horn still in situ there in Montana. It's a 48-inch long Triceratops horn. Now, horn is, well, I'm not going to speak for Mark because I'm going to show you the video of it. So he's going to explain what he found in this horn. We're hoping that the audio works good here.
And I'm looking at something very exciting. I'm looking at dinosaur bone in my dissecting microscope. This is bone that I have put through what's called a decalcification process, and I'm actually seeing the soft tissues left over after the bone mineral has been decalcified or taken away. This is very exciting, of course, because dinosaurs are supposed to have lived and died some 65 million years ago. And yet we still find soft tissues in their bones. This actually happens to be a Triceratops horn that we dug out of the Hells Creek Formation in Montana. So on this series of videos, you're going to see some very interesting information about the dig, about the bones that we found, and about the soft tissues that we're finding in them. Here now is a piece of Triceratops bone that has been decalcified, so all the bone minerals have been removed. You can see how many of the blood vessels are here. This white area here, this is soft tissue on top of these blood vessels. So the bone is very stiff because it's fossilized, but yet there's soft tissue in here. This is about 40 power under the dissecting microscope. As I move this, you can see these soft tissues waving back and forth in the liquid. So this is impossible for these soft tissues to be here if these bones are that old. This would all be gone. But here you see the matrix of blood vessels that have all been permineralized. They're all hard rock, and yet these white areas show all of the soft tissue that is still present here after decalcification. So this is an indication that these bones are very young and not even 20,000 years old, probably much younger than that. So here we've redone the experiment with the little lighter fixative, and we have a piece of biofilm pulled yet from another piece of Triceratops horn, and look at how stretchy this is. This is almost like taffy. And so these biofilms, where bacteria come and eat the Triceratops tissue, leave these films, and inside of here are pieces of Triceratops tissues that we're going to thin section and show you the actual cells of the Triceratops bone tissue, the soft remaining tissue that's in these bones. And we'll do that next under high magnification microscopy. Here you see a piece of Triceratops horn that was collected recently at the Hell Creek Formation in the Badlands of Montana. Soft tissue in dinosaur bones has been reported from Montana since the late 1990s into early 2000s. However, these tissues were found in a Triceratops femur. This example we're showing you here is a Triceratops horn. Now, a femur is highly encapsulated, and so it's not surprising that some soft tissues would be found in the deep center of it. But a Triceratops horn is highly vascular, and so we did collect this horn, a 48-inch long horn, in the Badlands of Montana. We brought it back to the lab, and here we are investigating, looking for presence of soft tissues in it. Now, this is a highly vascular bone that was exposed to the soil and water and ice and freezing and thawing and insects and plant roots and fungal bodies and all manner of organisms trying to decompose this. And so the finding of soft tissues in this Triceratops horn is staggering. And the reason we're showing this is because few people realize it. We creationists wanted to go out and mount our own expedition and find our own samples so that we could publish widely on this, and we have. We published all of this in Acta Histochemica. In fact, it cost me my job at a state university in California, California State University, Northridge. Now, this has major implications for the age of Earth and fossils. If soft tissues in dinosaur bones are the norm, and that is what we are predicting, then these bones cannot be 65 million years old because they're loaded with soft tissues. These break down quickly, and so they can't be old at all. Now I'm going to quickly show you some of these thin sections under the microscope. You can see the tiny little osteocytes in them. Sorry this goes so quickly, but I'm using antiquated equipment to film this. But look at these pieces of tissue full of osteocytes. These are all the little bone cells that maintain, manufacture, and produce bone. And so this is direct evidence of osteocytes in dinosaur bone collected from the Hell Creek Formation in Montana. Now, I also use a scanning electron microscope, and here you see under the scanning electron microscope some images of cells. These are individual osteocytes under the electron microscope. Look at the delicate filopodia or little tendrils coming off of them. These things should not be there if they're 65 million years old.
I don't know if you caught it. He mentioned that he lost his job when he published this at California State. They never even went to court. California State, Northridge settled with him, and I think since Mark has gotten his PhD, and so we're all happy for him, and he continues to do great work. One other thing that we'll look at is genetic research that indicates modern man is only about 6,500 years old. For several decades, anthropologists were trying to find Eve, and I say that in quotes, but the assumption was that the modern human race did come from one woman, and so they called her Eve. The thing is, the way that kind of research used to be studied was by comparing fossils, and it still is done that way. But a more accurate way, a more objective way to try and compare organisms is to compare their DNA. And so mitochondrial DNA is used to determine ancestral relationships now and figure out how long ago two individuals had a common ancestor, a common mother. And if you're studying mitochondrial DNA, that's what you're looking at, is the lineage through the women. I'm not going to describe how the research was done at this point. I'll simply read from some of the research that was so surprising when they finally did the work. What they were doing was, instead of assuming that chimpanzees and humans had a common ancestor 5 million years ago and then doing their calculations, they just took individuals who they knew were descendants of one another and then looked at the differences in the mitochondrial DNA. So they had empirical data on how many mutations would take place from one generation to the next. And instead of assuming that these mutations represent 5 million years worth of time. So they said, after they did this research, using our empirical rate to calculate the mitochondrial DNA clock would result in an age for modern man's last common ancestor, Eve, of about 6,500 years. This was the research that they came up with. Notice it's published in Nature, okay? And again, a secular, probably the most prestigious secular scientific journal there is. But there's a comma after the word years, not even a period, because they couldn't even finish the sentence without completely saying, but we don't believe our work. They said completely incompatible with the known age of modern humans. Another researcher commented that no one thinks this is the case. Well, the thing is, there are plenty of people that think this is the case. Lots of scientists believe this is the case. Certainly not as many as believe in the evolutionary scenario, but that's the way this research was treated, even though it was empirical and the known age for modern humans, the modern human race, is based on extrapolation and assumption. Thus, empirically speaking, and isn't that what science is supposed to be? Empirical? Empirically speaking, the best estimates for the age of the modern human race is about 6,500 years. Further confirmation of what the Bible speaks of is found in the descendants of, well, not Noah, the descendants of Noah's sons. In the Anthropological Review, 2004, this particular article, Mitochondrial DNA and Human Evolution, reviewed all the information that we've got about mitochondrial DNA research. And this is a quotation from it. Through the time frame and area from which humans dispersed in this study, though the time frame and area from which humans dispersed in this study differed from the Bible, even evolution-based studies recognize 3 major mitochondrial lineages. What does that indicate? Well, the mitochondria comes through the mother. It doesn't come through the male. Okay? So, after the flood, how many women repopulated the earth? 3. Noah's sons' wives. Not Noah's sons. I mean, obviously they were the fathers, but the mitochondrial DNA that they're studying, it comes through the women. And you've got these 3 women who are not related, and so their mitochondrial DNA will be different from each other, a few different mutations in each one of them, and all the human race from there on then stems from those 3 basic mitochondrial DNA sequences, and then they keep varying through time up to the present day. So Noah's 3 daughters-in-law are the basis for the 3 major mitochondrial DNA lineages found in the human race, which is exactly what we would expect, given what the Bible says. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you." It's sort of interesting. There's a couple of different places where the specific mention of "and your sons' wives." You're thinking, what matters? Well, looking back, now we see that I think the Lord sort of knew that it'd be interesting to be reminded, those mitochondrial DNA lived those three women. The thing is, notice it wasn't just the human beings that sort of started from almost scratch to repopulate the earth. All the other creatures God also mentions would breed abundantly on the earth, be fruitful, and multiply. And so, now the latest mitochondrial DNA research in genetics has rocked the scientific community again. This is an article published in 2018 in Human Evolution. It's in the Rockefeller Journal. Again, these are not creation publications. And what these researchers, Steckel and Thaler, were wanting to do was come up with an agreed upon means to identify a species. Now, most of you may figure, what do you mean, identify a species? Don't we know how to identify a species? I mean, it's if two creatures can mate and produce viable offspring, that's a species, right? Wrong. There are so many different ideas about how we should say this is a specific species and this is a different one. There's a lot of arguing and debating about this in the scientific community, in the biological community. And so these guys were just like, hey guys, let's come up with something that we can all agree on and say, this defines a species, okay? And if it doesn't fit this criteria, then we'll all agree this is a different species. They may look the same, chipping sparrow and a house sparrow, whatever. But anyway, that's what they were trying to do. But they ended up discovering something dramatically different, even though they still proposed that this technique would be a good way to define species, and I think it would be. Whether or not scientists can agree upon it, I don't know. But out of this work, these comparative studies used a specific section of the mitochondrial DNA. It's a gene that codes for an enzyme. And this particular gene is found in all organisms that have mitochondria, okay? So you can compare every species, you can look at this one gene and all the different species and compare them. They treated this gene, the information in it, that's got those little letters, the A, G, C, T, the DNA bases. They treated those codes like a barcode. So just today, I bought some Fuji apples, but I could have scanned a delicious apple and a Fuji apple, and that thing that reads it would know the difference because of the little differences in the barcode, right? So they're going to treat this gene like a barcode. They were compared to determine the differences in the DNA between 100,000 different species that are alive today. And the number of differences then between the individuals, and those differences come from mutations within a recognized species, were used to calculate how long ago those species diverged from one another. So if you've got a bunch of differences between this species and that species, then they would assume that they had a common ancestor further back in history than if there were only a few differences between the DNA coding of this species and that species. That was the assumption, and that's what they were looking for. Well, what they found was not what they were looking for. The research published in 2018 using those barcodes indicated that not only did all humans have a recent common ancestor, verifying that research done back at the end of the 1990s, 90% of all species of animals can trace their ancestry to recent parents at a common point in history. In other words, most animals have had a common restart resulting in the repopulation of the earth. So the words may make it a little difficult to understand. I'm going to show you a chart that may clarify it. But first, the reaction was pretty hectic. All humans may be descended from just two people, and a catastrophic event almost wiped out all species 100,000 years ago. Now, note that 100,000 years is using that assumption about chimps and humans. It's ignoring the empirical data that humans have a 6,500-year history. So that particular value is incredibly short by their standards, but of course it still doesn't fit the biblical one, but we don't need to accept that since they're not using empirical data to come up with 100,000 years. Here's what's going on. So these are just examples, I just made some up, of modern day species. You got elephants, humans, ravens, gorillas, lions. Okay, so within the alligator species, when they check the mitochondrial DNA in that barcode, there'll be a couple little differences, and so they take those differences and they trace that back in time to say, okay, how long ago did the alligators have a common mother? Where did the alligators start, so to speak? Doing this with all these different species, 100,000 different species. They assayed 5 million organisms. When they did all that research, all those extrapolations of mutations going back until there was a common ancestor for each identified species, all went back to the same point in history. And they are all quite separate from one another. So there's no overlap, between alligators and crocodiles or pigeons and ravens. What was astounding is that they all went back to the same point in Earth history. So the proposal was, well, there must have been some catastrophe, and then virtually all animals on Earth started over again to repopulate the Earth. Well, what does that sound like? Here's some of the summaries then of the work. Genetic barcodes of 5 million animals from 100,000 different species were surveyed. Research prompted speculation that humans and animals sprang from a single pair. So see, now it's not just the humans. All the animals, they all go back to one point in history too, where they all start repopulating the Earth. This may have happened after a catastrophic event, after the last ice age. Well, of course, they're going to call it an ice age. But we would even submit that an ice age ensued after the flood. Finally, then, the study has been misunderstood by some religious parties. It's always religious. I'm not a scientist. I'm a religious kook, according to the evolutionists. Whenever there's a creationist that will propose any kind of an objection or new evidence like Mark Armitage did, oh, you're just a religious fanatic and you're a kook because you believe the Bible instead of empirical evidence. Oh, wait a minute. Who's using empirical evidence in this particular argument? Religious parties who interpret it as challenging evolutionary theory, which has been denied by the authors. Yes, it certainly was denied by the authors. There was such a furor of pushback from this research that in less than a month after the article was published, this addendum was put at the very top of the article. Note added by authors: this study is grounded in and strongly supports Darwinian evolution, including the understanding that all life has evolved from a common biological origin over several billion years. This work follows mainstream views of human evolution. We do not propose there was a single Adam or Eve. We do not propose any catastrophic events. Well, but yes, they did. And if you go back 4 years, research always will have, build one research project on another. Well, 4 years previous to the publication that we've been looking at. This also this was published in another very well-known article, well-known journal. The title was "DNA Barcoding Works in Practice, but Not in Neutral Theory," and that says a whole lot too, but I won't explain that. But in the article, the authors assert their findings can be explained by a global population crash, and they admit that the idea of a single global population crash is, and this is in quotes because they said this, almost a Noah's Ark hypothesis, though this appears unlikely. And they speculated that perhaps long-term climate cycles might cause widespread periodic bottlenecks. Bottlenecks being that you sort of wipe everything out and then start repopulating from this bottleneck. It's always climate change, right? So, when they say that we never proposed a global catastrophe and all that kind of stuff, well, yes, they did, but they got such flack, so much opposition from the evolutionary community that they had to draw back and put that little note at the beginning. Why would you put a note like that at the beginning before you start reading it? Well, because if you read the article, by the time you're done, that's what you're thinking. So they're putting in your mind, before you start thinking this, oh no, it's not. There's all kinds of evidence supporting the historical accuracy of the Bible, the history of origins, and the record of human history. The Bible is God's Word, and God's Word is trustworthy. There'd be obviously so much more to look at, but I hope a few of these things that we've looked at tonight, maybe some of them were new to you, something to ponder and be encouraged by. If you have not been that concerned about having every little evidence confirmed, but I think it's important to not dismiss the importance of these kinds of apologetic arguments, especially with young people. And so, let's be reminded of this beautiful text in Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and don't lean on your own understanding. Certainly don't lean on the understanding of a bunch of atheistic evolutionists. And in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. Let's close in prayer. Lord, thank you for the work that many scientists have done, creationists and unbelievers alike. The minds that you've given us and the abilities that you've given us. And yet, time and time again, though they're not looking for it, scientists swerve into the truth. And we thank you for that, the encouragement that it is. Thank you for your word most of all. And the revelation there that lets us know that indeed we did not come from animals. You created us in your image. It's a great privilege and a responsibility, Lord. Help us to live by your word, obey it, treasure it. Thank you for our time together tonight. I pray that you'll give us a safe journeys home. I pray in Jesus' name. Well, it's yeah. I was just going to say it's a little bit after 8, so the sessions go from 7 to 8. But if you have some questions, those of you who want to go, you should feel free to go. We don't want to lock you in here while people ask questions. But if you want to stay, and those of you who have some questions, I'll be glad to entertain any that I can.
Could you remind me again why they picked the ostrich to compare?
Well, I would submit that they picked the ostrich because right now you will even see it written that dinosaurs aren't extinct. Birds are dinosaurs. And when you look at an ostrich, I mean, let's face it, it sort of looks like a dinosaur. It's got the big long neck. It doesn't have wings that let it fly and so forth, big long legs. And so an ostrich looks a lot like a dinosaur. And so it's just that sort of subliminal, see, you got the dinosaurs and then you've got the birds. And so let's compare ostriches and dinosaurs' blood vessels to show you that, see, they look the same. So, because they could have picked a chicken, they could have picked a possum, they could have picked anything with a blood vessel, and those blood vessels would look the same. I don't know of any difference between mammal blood vessels and bird blood vessels, and but they picked an ostrich, and there was a purpose behind that.
One little point I make when I'm speaking on liming, something like that, the chlorophyll molecule and it's built around one atom of magnesium. And in a blood vessel, the
Hemoglobin?
Hemoglobin, excuse me, is identical. It's just built around one atom of iron. And so here you have, look how diverse, you have one plant, one animal, but yet look how they compare. That shows design.
Indeed.
not random selection.
Yeah, the comparison between hemoglobin and chlorophyll are very similar, but yet they do such incredibly different things.
Yeah.
And they do require different atoms. Yes, sir.
Somewhere in the Bible, it wasn't Behemoth or Leviathan, it was some other dragon-type being that breathed fire. And on your radio broadcast, you were talking about, how there was this animal called the bombardier beetle.
Yes.
Which, most people would say there couldn't be such a dragon or anything like that. And the bombardier beetle, nobody had ever heard of it. So, could you talk about
Yeah,
that?
sure. The comment was there are Behemoth and Leviathan are described in great detail in the book of Job. Leviathan, as it's described, appears to be a fire-breathing dragon, is what we would call it. And so people scoff at that and say it's just a mythical creature because it's silly, the idea of an animal producing fire or an explosion. And yet there's a little beetle called the bombardier beetle that mixes chemicals, and when they hit the air, it explodes. Now, it's not a flame per se, but you certainly can mix various types of chemicals and get a flame. So if a beetle can do it, if God created a beetle to do it, because how do you evolve the apparatus to cause combustion step by step? It's absurd. You've got to have all that working properly. If God can create a bombardier beetle, he certainly could create a giant dragon that could produce chemicals that when it breathed out would combust. So people will object, and yet there are all kinds of examples around us to show that it's reasonable.
Doesn't one of the dinosaurs or the behemoths have two chambers that it could make the chemicals in different chambers?
Do any dinosaur, you're asking, do any dinosaurs have evidence in the skull of two chambers where they could produce that? I don't know. I know that it's curious. Some creationists have proposed, I don't know how far it's gone, that one of the definitions of a dinosaur, there are two features that define a dinosaur. A dinosaur has 4 holes in its head, and it has it walks upright. So up on its legs, not arms out sideways like a lizard. And there's no understanding of what that extra chamber is, because mammals, even reptiles, just have 3 holes on each side of their head. Eye, nostril, and ear hole. Dinosaurs got an extra hole there. And I don't know of any proposal as to the purpose of that. So some creationists have said maybe that was a place where the material could come out. The thing is, all dinosaurs weren't fire-breathing, so I don't know about that.
It is really interesting, and thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. It's really interesting. I grew up in New York City, and one of the places I went to so many times, I even brought my goodness, how old was he, Helen? Maybe 4 years old. My 4-year-old eldest son with a little stroller to the Museum of Natural History in New York City, which to me is a fascinating place.
Oh, yeah.
That said, with so much erroneous information, I mean, it's fascinating, and I'm just thinking to myself, this is so crazy. I mean, they show all these, like, one of their famous exhibits was the exhibit of the horse, the evolution of the horse. And,
We're going to look at that tomorrow.
Huh?
We're going to look at that tomorrow.
It's so fascinating.
The evolution of the horse, by the way,
evolution of
so
the
they can hear
horse.
it on there.
And it's these pictures, and and this went to this, and this went to this, and yet, I used to look at that and I'd say, how come we haven't seen anything between that? Or the same thing with humans, or the same thing with other animal types, that there was never any link between them. Thus, the quote-unquote missing link.
Right. Well, with the horse especially, they do try to show, the transitional forms. The problem is when we actually look at the timing of the existence of those fossils, they aren't separated by time. They are all coexistent. So But it's fascinating, the information that you come across in a museum. One of the things that I like to do is I like to, especially some of the ones that I'm quite certain are incorrect. So take a picture of it and come back in a couple years when new research has been conducted, and suddenly that particular thing that they had presented as fact in the museum isn't accepted by anybody anymore. Things like the sponge was the oldest animal. Okay? You go to a museum and you used to see the sponge was at the very bottom of the evolution of animals. Oh, well, guess what? Now we find out that the jellyfish is. And the jellyfish is far more complex than a sponge. But in the museums, you got the sponge down there at the very bottom. And so you find that kind of thing all the time. And yet, if you question it as it is presented now, what are you, some creationist or something? You can't question it. But it gets changed all the time. And I'm not criticizing the change. That's the nature of science. You get new information, and then you alter your hypothesis, or you alter what you're saying happened. But but you can't criticize it now. It's a sad thing, because most science isn't like that. It's just in the study of origins. Because the study of origins, frankly, is really outside of the realm of real science anyway, because you can't repeat it. Real science takes empirical data and repeats it. So, but it's not about the science. It's much more about a spiritual battle. What kind of faith do you want? You want a faith in yourself or a faith in your Creator? I can't believe nobody asked any questions about mitochondrial DNA. Maybe you didn't even understand enough to ask a question.
It's so funny. I wasn't going to talk about mitochondrial DNA because I told you I'm not a scientist.
Uh-huh.
So that I don't understand. But I remember I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine back many years ago, and he had his PhD in biochemistry from UCLA.
Mm-hmm.
Guy was thinking brilliant. And then he went to medical school, and then he did a surgical residency.
Mm.
That's when I met him. And so we were having this kind of conversation, and all of a sudden he goes, Dave, like when you think of mitochondria, again, he's a biochemist in his brain. When you think of mitochondria, and he's just nodding his head, and he starts, he starts using words that, of course, I'm sure I studied it, but I didn't really, he was really in his own brain. And he kept on just breaking down the mitochondria into its different sub-levels within it. You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying. But anyway, and he goes, Dave, I could almost, just like in the Bible with Paul and in the book of Acts, I could almost, there's just no way. And I was actually sharing the gospel with him, and he says, I don't believe.
Yeah, it's too bad, because the reason that is used to figure out these things is in so many ways set aside to deny the evidence that that everything that you look at, you would never, ever assign that complexity to chance.
No.
And yet you can look at something like the mitochondria, which is just a tiny little organ inside of a cell being inside of a tissue being inside of an organism. You can look at all of that. The encyclopedia, literally the encyclopedia of written information in the DNA of an organism, and deny that that's a design. And yet, if we get a list of 10 prime numbers from outer space on a radio signal, there's intelligent life out there. And it's just like those stones that I showed you. One little comment on a cuneiform tablet, David exists. Chapters and chapters of history that And, oh, no, that's not true. That's all made up. It shows what the human heart can do.
It does.
They don't want to believe.
That's right.
They don't want.
Well, it's 1:15. That's probably enough for tonight. Like I mentioned, tomorrow evening, we're going to look at a video of the late Dr. Dave Minton showing us some really fascinating things about Lucy. And we're going to look at some fossils about the horse evolution. And it'd be great to see you tomorrow evening. Thanks for coming tonight. God bless you.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Yeah, David, nice to meet you. Thank you, thank you.